The world knew them as kings of different kingdoms. Elvis Presley, the man who made white America move its hips, stood in a private room at the International Hotel in Las Vegas, adjusting his jeweled belt buckle. Across from him, James Brown, the Godfather of Soul, sat motionless in a velvet chair, his hands folded, his expression unreadable behind dark sunglasses. It was August 1969, and what happened in that room over the next 43 minutes would never appear in any official biography. The only reason we know anything at all is because a young sound engineer, setting up equipment for Elvis's midnight show, accidentally left a tape running in the adjacent control booth. That tape, discovered in a storage facility in Memphis 37 years later, captured something both men spent the rest of their lives refusing to discuss. 2 security guards stood outside the door. Neither Elvis's manager, Colonel Tom Parker, nor James Brown's entourage knew this meeting was happening. When James finally stood to leave, witnesses reported that Elvis's hands were shaking. To understand what happened in Las Vegas that August night, you have to go back to where it all began, to the dirt roads of Barnwell, South Carolina, where a 4-year-old boy watched his mother walk away and never return. James Brown built his empire from that abandonment, turned that pain into fuel that would burn for 50 years without ever going out. Every scream he unleashed on stage, every impossible dance move that defied physics, all of it came from that primal wound, that need to prove he was worth staying for. By 1969, James Brown had become more than a performer. He had become a force of nature, a man who had literally changed the molecular structure of American music, with 3 notes and a concept he called the One, that earth-shaking emphasis on the first beat that transformed rhythm and blues into funk. He had saved cities from burning, stood on stages the night after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and told angry crowds to go home. Boston listened because James Brown asked them to. Elvis Presley's journey started differently, but ended up in a strangely parallel place. Born in Tupelo, Mississippi, to a family so poor they lived in a 2-room house his father built by hand. Elvis grew up surrounded by the sounds of black churches and Beale Street blues. He absorbed those sounds like a sponge, let them seep into his bones until they became part of his DNA. When he walked into Sun Records in 1954 and sang Arthur Crudup's "That's All Right," with a hiccup in his voice and a swagger in his hips, he wasn't trying to steal anything. He was just being himself, a white boy who loved black music and had the rare gift of being able to perform it in a way that made white audiences feel safe enough to move their bodies. But intention and impact are 2 different things. Elvis became the king, while the architects of the sound he built his throne on remained largely unknown to mainstream white America. By 1969, Elvis was making a comeback after years lost to bad movies. Las Vegas was his resurrection, his chance to prove he still mattered. But James Brown had never needed a comeback because he had never gone away. The phone call that set everything in motion came on August 11th, 3 days before the meeting. James Brown was in his suite at the Flamingo when his private line rang. The voice on the other end belonged to Jerry Schilling, one of Elvis's trusted inner circle. Elvis wanted to meet. Private, off the record. No press, no managers, no handlers from either side. Just 2 men having a conversation that was long overdue. James listened without speaking for almost 30 seconds. Then he spoke, his voice measured and calm. He gave Schilling a date, a time, and a single condition. The room had to be swept for recording devices. Schilling agreed, not knowing that the universe had other plans. That a tired young sound engineer named Marcus Webb would forget to turn off a reel-to-reel recorder in the booth adjacent to the private suite. The 3 days between the phone call and the meeting felt longer than they should have. James Brown wasn't a man who did anything without preparation. He spent hours with Bobby Bird, his oldest friend, talking about how white performers had been covering black music since before either of them was born. They talked about Pat Boone getting rich off sanitized versions of Little Richard's explosions. They talked about how the system was designed to extract value from black innovation while keeping black innovators in the basement. But they also talked about Elvis specifically, about how he was different from the pure exploiters, about how he had genuine love and respect for the music. James wasn't going into that room to destroy Elvis. He was going in to have a conversation that America needed to hear but wasn't ready for. When James Brown walked into that private suite at exactly 10 p.m. on August 14th, 1969, the first thing he noticed was how nervous Elvis looked. The king of rock and roll was wearing his stage costume, a white jumpsuit with gold eagles embroidered across the chest. But the sweat stains under his arms betrayed his anxiety. James, by contrast, wore a perfectly tailored dark suit, his hair processed to perfection, his shoes reflecting the chandelier light like black mirrors. He removed his sunglasses slowly, folded them with deliberate precision, and placed them on the glass coffee table between them. For the first 2 minutes, according to the timestamp on the discovered tape, neither man spoke. Elvis shifted his weight on the sofa, his fingers drumming in anxious rhythm against his knee. James sat perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on Elvis with an intensity that made the silence grow teeth. When James finally spoke, his voice was quieter than Elvis expected, almost gentle, which somehow made the words cut deeper. I've started not with accusation, but with acknowledgement. He told Elvis that he knew Elvis loved the music, that he understood Elvis wasn't malicious, that the problem was bigger than any individual performer. But then James asked the question that had been burning in his chest for 15 years. He asked Elvis if he understood what it felt like to create something revolutionary and watch someone else get credit for it simply because their skin color made white audiences comfortable. He asked if Elvis knew what it was like to work twice as hard, to be twice as good, and still see younger white artists climb charts with watered-down versions of sounds born in black churches and juke joints. James spoke for 12 uninterrupted minutes, and his voice never rose above conversational volume. He didn't need to shout. Every word landed with the weight of historical truth. Elvis's response wasn't defensive. According to the transcript pieced together by music historians who gained access to the tape in 2006, Elvis acknowledged everything James said. He admitted that he had benefited from a system designed to privilege white performers. He talked about his own poverty, his own struggles. But he never used those struggles to deflect from James's larger point. He spoke about the black artists who had influenced him, about how he had tried to give them credit, about how he felt trapped in a machine that wanted him to be something he wasn't sure he wanted to be anymore. There was a vulnerability in Elvis's voice that few people ever heard. But James didn't let him off the hook completely. He pushed back, gently but firmly, pointing out that intention didn't absolve impact, that Elvis's discomfort with his own success didn't change the economic realities for black artists who created the blueprints Elvis had used to build his empire. What happened next, in the 23rd minute of the conversation, transformed the meeting from a confrontation into something more profound. James Brown did something unexpected. He stopped talking about the past and started talking about the future. He laid out a vision for how things could be different, how artists with platform and power could use that influence to change the systems that perpetuated inequality. He talked about ownership, about black artists controlling their own masters, their own publishing, their own destiny. He talked about the need for white artists who benefited from black innovation to actively advocate for their black peers, not just in interviews but in boardrooms, in contract negotiations, in the places where real power was exercised. James wasn't asking Elvis to apologize or flagellate himself with white guilt. He was challenging him to do something, to use his throne for something beyond his own resurrection. Elvis listened, and according to Marcus Webb, the engineer who later reviewed the tape dozens of times, something shifted in the room during this section. The tension began to transform into something that resembled mutual understanding, if not complete agreement. Elvis started asking questions, real questions, about how he could help, what actions would actually make a difference versus empty gestures. James answered each question with specificity, talking about radio play, about touring packages that featured black headliners, about using interviews to redirect attention to the originators of the sounds white audiences were consuming. This wasn't a theoretical discussion. James was offering Elvis a roadmap. But then James said something that cut through all the theoretical talk and brought everything back to raw human truth. He told Elvis about the night in 1962 when he recorded live at the Apollo, the album that would become his breakthrough. James described standing in that legendary venue, knowing that this recording had to be perfect, because black artists didn't get second chances, didn't get the benefit of doubt that white performers received automatically. He talked about the physical toll of being the hardest working man in show business, about how that title wasn't a boast, but a requirement, a minimum standard he had to meet every single night. And then James asked Elvis a question that the tape captured with devastating clarity. He asked Elvis if he had ever felt that level of pressure, that sense that his every performance was being judged not just as an individual effort, but as a referendum on whether people who looked like him deserved a seat at the table. The silence that followed lasted 41 seconds. Elvis didn't answer immediately because he couldn't. The honest answer was no, and both men knew it. When Elvis finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. He admitted that he had never thought about it in those terms, that his struggles, real as they were, existed in a completely different context. He talked about how the system had lifted him up while simultaneously crushing the people who had taught him everything he knew about music. And then Elvis did something that surprised even James Brown. He apologized. Not a defensive apology, not an apology designed to make himself feel better, but a genuine acknowledgement of harm and complicity. The conversation took its most intense turn in the 34th minute when James brought up Little Richard. He recounted how Richard Penniman had created a sound so revolutionary that it literally changed the trajectory of popular music overnight. James described watching white artists, including Elvis, cover Little Richard's songs and achieve massive commercial success, while Richard himself struggled financially for years. James wasn't singling out Elvis as uniquely guilty, but he was using Richard's story as a case study of how the system worked. The pain in James's voice when he talked about Little Richard was personal, because James had watched his own innovations get repackaged and resold dozens of times. Elvis's response revealed something crucial about his character. He didn't deflect or make excuses. He acknowledged that he had covered Little Richard's songs early in his career, that those covers had helped establish him as a performer. But then he revealed something that wasn't widely known. He talked about how he had fought with his label to get permission to bring black artists on tour with him in the 50s, about how those fights had been shut down by people who controlled his career. He described the frustration of being a symbol of rebellion while simultaneously being controlled by conservative forces. Elvis wasn't trying to position himself as a victim, but he was trying to illustrate the complexity of his situation. James listened without interrupting, and when Elvis finished, James acknowledged that he understood the constraints Elvis had operated under. But then James said something that became the emotional climax of the entire conversation. He told Elvis that understanding constraints wasn't the same as accepting them, that true courage meant fighting those constraints, even when the fight seemed impossible. In the 39th minute of the conversation, James Brown revealed something he had never said publicly. He talked about his mother, about watching her walk away when he was 4 years old, about spending his entire life trying to prove that he was worth something, worth staying for. He connected that childhood trauma directly to his relentless work ethic, to his obsessive need to be perfect, to be undeniable. James explained that every time he saw a white artist get credit for innovations he had pioneered, it reopened that original wound, that feeling of not being enough. This wasn't political posturing anymore. This was raw human vulnerability, a man exposing the deepest pain of his soul to someone he barely knew. The tape captured something in James's voice during this section that was rarely heard in his public persona, a fragility beneath the funk. Elvis's reaction, according to the audio, was immediate and visceral. There were sounds on the tape that suggested he was crying, that James's confession had broken something open in him too. Elvis started talking about his own mother, Gladys, about how her death in 1958 had shattered him in ways he never recovered from. He talked about how he had turned to music as a way to process that grief. The two men, for several minutes, weren't kings of different kingdoms anymore. They were just two Southern boys who had loved their mothers and lost them, who had used music to fill voids that nothing else could touch. This shared vulnerability created a bridge between them that transcended race and genre and commercial success. As the conversation moved into its final minutes, James laid out a specific proposal. He asked Elvis to use his upcoming Vegas performances to spotlight black artists, to bring them on stage, to tell audiences explicitly that the music they loved came from black innovation. He asked Elvis to use his interviews to redirect, credit, to stop letting white journalists frame him as a solitary genius. And most importantly, James asked Elvis to use his financial power and industry connections to help black artists secure better deals, own their masters, control their destiny. Elvis agreed to all of it. According to the tape, he made specific commitments, naming artists he would feature, outlets he would use to spread the message. Whether Elvis followed through on all these promises is a matter of historical debate. Some music historians point to evidence that Elvis did advocate behind the scenes for black artists in the early 70s. Others argue that Elvis's final years, marked by declining health and increasing isolation, prevented him from fulfilling the vision he and James discussed that night. What isn't debatable is that something profound happened in that room. When James Brown finally stood to leave, 43 minutes after sitting down, both men embraced. It wasn't a brief, performative hug. It was a long, genuine embrace between two men who had reached something resembling understanding. The two security guards stationed outside the door later reported that when James emerged, his eyes were red, but his posture was straighter than when he had entered. Elvis remained in the room for another 20 minutes before emerging. Multiple witnesses confirmed that his hands were shaking, that he looked like a man who had just been forced to see himself clearly for the first time in years. He canceled his midnight show that night, the only time in his Vegas residency that he failed to perform without a medical reason. Neither James Brown nor Elvis Presley ever spoke publicly about that meeting. When journalists asked James about his relationship with Elvis in subsequent years, he would offer diplomatic non-answers. When Elvis was asked about James Brown, he would praise James's artistry, but never mention the Vegas conversation. The omission was so consistent and deliberate that it became suspicious to those who paid attention. But without the tape, there was no proof that the meeting had even occurred. The tape itself remained hidden for 37 years, stored in a Memphis facility among thousands of other reels. Marcus Webb, the engineer who accidentally recorded the conversation, didn't realize what he had captured until weeks later. By then, he was terrified of the legal consequences. He labeled the tape with a generic code and stored it in his personal collection, telling no one. It wasn't until 2006, 2 years after Webb's death, that his daughter found the tape while sorting through his belongings and listened to it out of curiosity. She immediately recognized the voices and understood the historical significance. She contacted music historians, who verified the authenticity through voice analysis and contextual details. The discovery of the tape reignited conversations about cultural appropriation, artistic influence, and racial justice in the music industry. Scholars dissected every word, every pause, every emotional inflection. Some praised James Brown for his courage in confronting Elvis directly. Others praised Elvis for his willingness to listen, to acknowledge his privilege. A few critics argued that private conversations between individuals couldn't address systemic problems that required collective action. All of these perspectives contained truth. The conversation between James and Elvis was both monumentally important and painfully insufficient. James Brown continued his relentless work ethic until his death on Christmas Day 2006, just months after the tape was discovered. He never publicly commented on the recording, but those close to him reported that he seemed relieved that the conversation had finally become part of the historical record. In his final interviews, James talked more openly about the struggles black artists faced, about ownership and control, about the importance of young black musicians understanding their history. Whether the Vegas conversation with Elvis contributed to this increased willingness to speak truth is impossible to prove definitively. But the timing is suggestive. Elvis Presley's legacy remains complicated by the conversation captured on that tape. He died in 1977, 8 years after the meeting, his final years marked by health problems that prevented him from fully realizing the commitments he made to James. But there is evidence that he tried. In 1970, he insisted that his Aloha from Hawaii concert feature performances by black artists in the pre-show segments. In interviews from the early 70s, he spoke more explicitly about his influences, naming black artists and directing fans to their original recordings. These efforts were imperfect and insufficient, but they represented movement. The tragedy is that Elvis ran out of time before he could do more. The 43-minute conversation between James Brown and Elvis Presley didn't change the music industry overnight. Systemic problems require systemic solutions, and two men talking in a hotel suite couldn't dismantle structures built over centuries. But the conversation mattered because it showed that difficult dialogues are possible, that people can meet across chasms of experience and privilege, and reach something resembling understanding. James Brown walked into that room, carrying the weight of every black artist who had been exploited, overlooked, or erased. He emerged having planted seeds that would continue growing long after both men were gone. The hip-hop generation that sampled James's funk breaks understood implicitly what that Vegas conversation made explicit: that black innovation deserves recognition, compensation, and respect. That understanding, imperfect as its implementation remains, traces back to conversations like the one James and Elvis had, to moments when truth was spoken and heard even when it hurt.